Hello, everyone. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first talk of the 2021-22 academic year in our Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series. I could not have asked for a better speaker to start things off. Jeffrey Herbst is the president of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, California, and has previously served as the president of Colgate University, as president of the Newseum in Washington, D.C., and as provost of Miami University. He's a professor of political science specializing in comparative politics and is the author of State Politics in Zimbabwe, 1990, and States and Power in Africa, Comparative Lessons in Authority and Control of 2000, which received the Lubert Best Book Award in Comparative Politics from the American Political Science Association. I should add that Jeffrey Herbst is a Yale alum. He received his PhD from Yale in 1987. And when I read the thoughtful and thought-provoking article on campus anti-Semitism that he published this summer in Inside Higher Ed, and I saw that he had gone to Yale, I realized that he would be the perfect person to help us think through the question of how to talk about Middle East politics on campus in this time of escalating conflict. As some of you know, this talk is all the more timely after the recent discovery of racist and anti-Semitic graffiti on the Yale campus this past week. So here's how, things will work. President Herbst will speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, after which he will take questions from the audience. So please submit your questions at any time during the talk using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and then I will ask those questions anonymously. The chat function is disabled, so please don't use that. And we will end at 6 p.m. The title of today's talk is Anti-Semitism and Free Speech on College Campuses. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Herbst.
Professor Samuels, thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to speak to a Yale audience. I wish I could be in New Haven, but I'm grateful that we have the technology that allows me to address you on this important topic. To situate myself in this discussion, I am a Jew who is concerned, of course, about anti-Semitism. And as Professor Samuels said, I am president of a faith-based institution and have been a college administrator for some time. I'm also the former head of the Newseum in Washington, D.C., a cultural institution that was based on the First Amendment. So not only do I have an appreciation of the value of our free speech protections, but I have consistently argued that the solution to bad speech is more speech. I still believe that even when there is an issue such as anti-Semitism that I'm personally concerned with. Of course, the free speech protections of the First Amendment technically do not apply to private colleges such as Yale because the free speech guarantees in the Constitution are protections from government censorship. However, I think we would all agree that Yale and other private colleges aspire to the same free speech climate that is constitutionally guaranteed in public schools. And just to be clear, and to make it even more complicated, a significant amount of what people consider to be hate speech, including some anti-Semitic remarks, are, contrary to public belief, constitutionally protected. The ability to ban speech is constricted and depends on the immediacy and specificity of the threat. That being said, of course, there's a great deal of difference about what you can say and what you should say. Finally, I approach this topic gingerly, especially as much of it will focus on anti-Semitism and relationship to ongoing debates about the Middle East, because charges and discussions about anti-Semitism can sometimes take all the oxygen out of the room and cause us to avoid other issues. For instance, in the case of Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times correspondent, who's argued, albeit in a tentative manner, that Israel should not defend itself from Hamas rocket attacks, Kristof defends himself by saying, and it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel for possible war crimes. It's not, but it also could just be wrong. And the fact that critics can sometimes be wrong, but not be anti-Semitic is sometimes missed. Finally, in this discussion, I think the stakes are actually even higher than for people, including Jews, but not limited, of course, who are worried about anti-Semitism or people who want to debate the Middle East. Residential colleges such as Yale, along with military bases, despite their many problems, are among the most diverse residential settings in the United States in an increasingly polarized and segmented society. Residential colleges have a bedrock commitment to making all feel part of their community and to free speech, even if one or both of those core commitments are violated in practice. If there cannot be open, passionate debate about Israel and US foreign policy in the Middle East without lurching into anti-Semitism, then I'm afraid there's not much hope for a good debate in the rest of our society. If, on the other hand, as I hope, and as I'll argue throughout this talk, colleges and universities can model what civil discourse actually means, then I think there is hope for the rest of the society also debating these issues in a manner that's constructive. Of course, Israel has been a contentious issue on college campuses for decades. When I was a student at Princeton in the early 1980s, Israel had invaded Lebanon, and there was an enormous amount of controversy about those actions. However, I was at that time and for years after relatively sanguine about the atmosphere for Jewish students on most college campuses. Indeed, a decade ago, I was giving talks where I argued, contrary to growing fears at the time, that anti-Semitism on college campuses was not that much of a problem outside of a relatively few large public universities. I wasn't wrong, I believe, at the time, but I think the situation has changed, and I'm concerned now, very concerned. The indicators regarding college anti-Semitism have been flashing red for some time. Hillel reported that anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses rose to an all-time high in 2019-20, even with the closure of many due to the pandemic. There's been a constant drumbeat of anti-Semitic incidents that have grown disheartening. At the University of Southern California, a Jewish student was forced to resign as vice president of the student government after her harassment because of her pro-Israel views. At Arizona State University, Hitler Rose Right posters have been taken down several times. At the University of Connecticut, there have been repeated incidents of anti-Semitic graffiti and verbal insults of the type that Professor Samuels reported on the Yale campus just this week. A new poll surveying members of a leading predominantly Jewish fraternity and sorority found that more than 65% of the respondents have felt unsafe on campus due to anti-Semitic attacks, with 1 in 10 reporting that they have feared physical assault because they are openly Jewish. Additionally, nearly 70% of the students said they had personally experienced or were familiar with an act of anti-Semitism on campus or in a virtual campus setting in the last 120 days. As a result, and this is particularly disheartening, about 50% said they had hidden their Jewish identities, and more than half have avoided expressing their views on Israel. That's terrible, both for the students involved and for all of us who hope that a college campus will be welcoming, safe, and openly vibrant for all students. More generally, across Jewish communities in North America, there is a real fear today about the collegiate environment that Jewish students and supporters of Israel face. This has been fed by a constant drip of stories about physical confrontations that Jewish students have had, as well as a feeling that college administrators have not treated anti-Semitism with the same seriousness that they address other forms of hatred. Pains me to say this, but today I was talking to a friend and I was telling her that I was giving a talk to a Yale audience. And she told me that recently her daughter had been advised by a college counselor not to apply to Yale because it had a difficult environment for Jewish students. Now, I know it's very difficult to place one story in any particular context. And I know there's a lot of disinformation out there. And I see no data that Yale is actually more hostile to Jewish students than any other campus, or certainly its competitors. However, that is the kind of story and that is the kind of discussion that is out there. and that is now being entertained by large parts of the Jewish community that would, I think, have been inconceivable a decade ago. So I think the concern should be very real. Now, why is all this happening? Part of it, that situation in the United States is becoming more polarized. Public expressions of hatred towards many different groups are increasing, and this inevitably falls partially to the Jews. According to recent FBI statistics, American Jews, who make up no more than 2% of the US population, are targets of nearly 60% of religious bias. Anti-Semitism on college campuses has in particular morphed over time from old stereotypes about Jews to collateral damage from heated discussions about Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, and the United States' role in that region. This is somewhat different than debates in the public outside of colleges, where old stereotypes of Jews still often dominate anti-Semitic attacks. And certainly we saw in the upsurge in violence against Jews across US cities in May as a result of the Gaza conflict that there is a continuing rise of anti-Semitism, and this plays back on college campuses where the dynamic about heated debates about the Middle East turning into sometimes anti-Semitic attacks has been of primary concern to Jewish students. What else is different, I think, is that the institutional settings of debate about Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, the United States' role is being challenged. And I think this is a particular concern to people as myself who both value a safe environment for all students and one which promotes free speech. Opponents of Israel have taken as a strategy from migrating from individual voice, which I view as protected and often welcome, to demanding that institutions on college campuses take positions, something that I view as frightening and quite often inappropriate. Here I'll focus in part on the Yale campus, both because I'm nominally speaking to a Yale audience and because, as Professor Samuels noted, I'm an alum of this institution, but also because what's playing out on the Yale campus is playing out on many other college campuses across this country. Now, of course, many scholars, no doubt including some at Yale, have signed letters in their personal capacity strongly opposing Israel during the Gaza violence. I can argue with these individuals who I believe are sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes misinformed, sometimes anti-Semitic. However, they're using their voice to express their individual opinion, and I or others in the community are free to disagree with them on an equal playing field. While I might regret personally their views, I defend their right in most cases to have them, and I look forward to debating them. However, what has changed is that now some institutions on college campuses are being asked to take positions. As was noted widely on your campus, in June, the Yale College Council adopted a statement of condemnation of Israel that noted in part, as Yale students, we condemn the injustice, ethnic cleansing, and genocide occurring in Palestine, and continued, just as Israel's military imposes the apartheid system against Palestinians, the US police enforces a system of white supremacy against Black Americans. Now, I view those statements as exceptionally problematic because I do not believe, and I can argue this at greater length, that ethnic cleansing or genocide in fact characterizes what is going on in Israel and the Palestinian territories. And as someone who observed firsthand, who studied, wrote about apartheid in South Africa, I do not believe that it is an application where Arab Israelis have full political rights in Israel and where there is now an Arab political party and the ruling coalition. I don't know the exact origins of the resolution, and I would surmise that there was a fair amount of virtue signaling and other politicking. I do know that it was unfortunate because I think that a student government could have done a good turn in setting parameters for an open, free, fierce debate about Israel, but instead went in another direction and in fact closing off debate, adopting a position which it knew many students would disagree with or feel comfortable with. Still, these are young people, and as Deborah Lipstadt, the Biden administration's nominee for a special envoy to fight anti-Semitism, has noted, when looking at anti-Semites, we should differentiate between the simple one and the wicked one. As regrettable as the student government's views were, I'm under no illusion that students' governments are particularly important and have much of a power to structure conversation on campus. It is certainly possible, of course, that this statement could feel threatening to individual students, Jewish or non-Jewish, who are supporters of Israel, and that would be unfortunate. More likely, it will lead to the delegitimization of the student government itself. Of course, there's not much the Yale administration could have done about what the student government proclaims. It could have issued a statement contrary, but I understand why administrators might be reluctant to react to every student government statement. Much more problematic, in my view, were some faculty statements that have emerged from particular programs. The faculty in ethnicity, race, and migration issued a statement on Palestine on May 17th that said, as scholars in the program, we recognize the Palestinian struggle as an indigenous liberation movement confronting a settler colonial state illegally expropriating their land for over 70 years. Members of the Yale program went on to say, we express solidarity with the Palestinian people as they resist the many forms of Israeli state violence and fight for their freedom. We will amplify the voices of Palestinian scholars and center the anti-colonial struggles in our academic and political practice. No talk here, of course, to return to the 1967 lines or anything else. This is about the delegitimization of Israel and the promotion of a particular perspective in, as they say, their academic and public practice. Similarly, the Yale's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program signed a letter also endorsed by dozens of other women's and gender studies programs across the country titled Gender Studies Departments in Solidarity with Palestinian Feminist Collective, that among other things endorsed the unambiguous right of return for Palestinians, which depending on what this actually means, would amount to the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. Further, the letter said, we do not subscribe to a, quote, both sides, unquote, rhetoric that erases the military, economic, media, and global power that Israel has over Palestine. This is not a conflict, in quotes, that is too controversial and complex, in quotes, to assess. I'll get to the substantive issues with regard to Israel in a moment, but I think stepping back from Israel and anti-Semitism, that these statements are exceptionally problematic for a number of reasons. Speech and debate, the very things that these programs and others at a university were designed to encourage, are being stifled. Here I'm concerned about the boundaries of free speech being curtailed because those who have the power, and make no mistake, the professors and faculty in these programs speak from a privileged position in the hierarchy at Yale, are predetermining the outcome of certain intellectual debates. Indeed, they are delegitimizing anyone who has an opposing view. No less than the American Association of University Professors, in its 1940 profound statement on principles on academic and freedom and tenure, defined the prevailing professional standards of academic freedom of faculty. It stated, as scholars and educational officers, they, teachers, should remember that the public may judge their profession and their institution by their utterances. Hence, they should at all times be accurate, should exercise appropriate restraint, should show respect for the opinion of others, and should make every effort to indicate that they are not speaking for the institution. Academic freedom is a wonderful thing, but it comes with certain profound responsibilities. The implications of programs taking on political positions is that certain types of research and outcomes are privileged, as well as implications for hiring and teaching. At its basis, I think this is profoundly anti-intellectual by not only arguing that the other side is wrong, but stating really there is no other side. Now, I would say the exact same thing if an East Asian Studies department issued proclamations about genocide against the Uyghurs, even though I personally believe that genocide is being conducted by Beijing. But I don't believe it's the role of an academic department to take on political positions that change the contours of the free speech debate on campus. I headed the Department of Politics at Princeton for 5 years, which I believe is a distinguished academic unit. And I also have a lot of firm and deeply held political beliefs. It would never occur to me, frankly, to get to the department to endorse the positions I had, both because I didn't believe that others necessarily believed them, and I would have been worried on the implications for students, graduate students, departmental research, and the intellectual climate that the department was supposed to foster. Jewish students and those who are pro-Israel could legitimately complain, I think, that these proclamations and others cause a threatening environment. I have no idea about the individual sentiments of the faculty who have signed these proclamations, but I know that these kinds of statements, by delegitimizing certain intellectual positions, provide an environment for attack on supporters of Israel, and inevitably, because their positions are seen as illegitimate, attacks which converge on or leap over to anti-Semitism. And of course, vowing to support the resistance without differentiation of the Palestinians is not even a veiled endorsement of Hamas. It is an endorsement of Hamas and its decision to rain rockets down on Israelis, both Jews and Palestinians. It would have been easier to differentiate some sort of support vis-a-vis some sorts of resistance, but that was not done, leading these programs to implicitly endorse the proudly anti-Semitic organization, Hamas, that has at its fundamental charter calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. Now, it's my understanding, although I'm not well aware of the campus environment, that many at Yale have not spoken out against these program statements, despite the fact that I believe that they are significant departures from academic standards. I view that as unfortunate. As someone who believes that ethnicity, race, migration, and gender are critically important to understand, and who has tried to contribute in some of those areas, and as a college administrator, I would say that when you do not engage with colleagues who you believe have violated the norms of the university, you are essentially marginalizing them by essentially not taking them seriously enough to disagree. As another Yalie has said, those who do not confront these programs are guilty of the soft bigotry of low expectations. Why have universities had such trouble dealing with anti-Semitism, and why is there such concern among Jewish students and significant worry that the problem will get worse in the coming years, despite the fact that many universities with the best of intentions, including Yale, have devoted enormous resources to student affairs offices, to diversity, to bias training, and the like. Part of the answer is that fighting hatred, fighting bigotry on campuses is hard, and I recognize that, full stop. But there are also other issues that are specific to anti-Semitism. Jewish students are often coded as white by student affairs officers and by others. Seen as a privileged portion of society, the fact that these students may be vulnerable to anti-Semitic attacks is not put on the same plane of concern as possibilities of bigotry and hatred devoted against communities of color who have, of course, endured a tremendous amount of bigotry and hatred. This is despite the fact that the recently released Pew study on American Jewry found that 15% of Jews under the age of 30, might reasonably include the college population, identify Hispanic, Black, Asian, or multiracial. Of course, no student should be subject to hatred or bigotry, but the fact that Jews are not coded as among those groups who are traditionally been the recipients of tremendous hatred and bigotry produces, I would argue, some dissonance in collegiate approaches to how to deal with the problem. It's also the case that some portion, but by no means all, of the anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish students and who are supporters of Israel come from people who are involved in communities of color and who college administrators code as always being the recipients of hatred and bigotry and not necessarily as the perpetrators. What to do? The common answer is always more speech. That's been my answer for a long time. But isn't what I'm saying is that there's too much focus on Israel right now, and the sheer focus is part of what's propelling anti-Semitism? I don't believe that, and I'm fine with a lot of focus on Israel, but I think it has to be done with nuance and with care. Although it's obvious, it is worth saying that not every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. There are plenty of legitimate criticisms. And although heroic, powerful voices like Natan Sharansky have argued that it's anti-Semitic if Israel is treated in a fundamentally different manner, I'm not even sure of that. On some level, it's true, of course, but I don't take it that Israel should be held to a higher standard than Syria or other countries in the Middle East because of its own self-professed norms. It wants to be held to a higher standards, and yes, because it is a major US aid recipient. However, that makes it special but not unique, a differentiation that is important. And I'm not sure why there isn't additional speech on other issues. Take, for instance, Ethiopia, a country that I've studied as part of my own academic work. Ethiopia is a country that the US has given $13 billion in aid over the last 20 years, and that received, until the recent civil war began, around $3.5 billion in foreign assistance from major donors each year, including another significant share from multilateral institutions, which Americans in part share. Because of the civil war instigated in good part by the federal government in Addis, over 400,000 people, according to a recent report by the Council on Foreign Relations, in Tigray province are living in famine conditions. 79% of pregnant and lactating women screened over the course of a week were found to suffer from acute malnutrition, and only 11% of the humanitarian supplies needed in the region have actually been delivered since July. Delivery of medical supplies to Tigray is prohibited by the Ethiopian government, as is the delivery of fuel, making distribution of aid that does make into the region extraordinarily difficult. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that you cannot talk about Israel if you don't talk about Ethiopia. What I am saying is there should be more talk about Ethiopia, and in particular, understanding that the world is a complicated place. If you come to an understanding and a critique of Israel after at least some review of what is happening in the rest of the world, then you have a potentially respectable position, or at least one that can be argued with. However, if you immediately look at Israel as uniquely bad without understanding how the world works, then that is something else. The Yale College Council has not taken a thundering declaration on Tigray, and women's studies programs do not talk about women in Tigray. Even closer to home, I often wonder about the focus on Israel. Here, I'll talk briefly about the Biden and Obama administrations. I'll skip Trump for the moment only because the two others are the ones likely to be supported by a good part of the audience. President Biden's administration killed Zamari Ahmadi, it's important to say his name, by a drone in Afghanistan after he was going around Kabul collecting water bottles. 7 children were killed in collateral damage because of that drone attack. Yet there has not been a demand for a war crimes trial for a military that killed a person of color. I can only imagine if Netanyahu had done this. More generally, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, a total of 563 strikes, largely by drones, targeted Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen during Obama's two terms, about 10 times as many as under Bush. Between 384 and 800 civilians were killed in those countries, according to reports logged by the Bureau. And of course, those countries, unlike Gaza and Israel, did not provide any direct threat to the United States. And I've been struck by the fact that there's often more debate about the Israeli conduct of conflict in the United States than there has been about the American conduct of conflict. Although you would think that Americans are most concerned about the governments that they themselves elect directly. Now, why is this? Well, lots of people are passionate about Israel and Palestine. I get that. It's easier to cover Gaza than it is Yemen. That's an issue. Some Americans are more interested in criticizing Netanyahu, who was still prime minister during the last Gaza conflict, than in the own leaders that they support. That's less okay, I think. Hamas has made a tactical decision to make its people vulnerable and then use their deaths as delegitimating the Israeli right to defense. It has its supporters and its fellow travelers who have fallen in with this media strategy. And then the Israel conflict with Palestinians has been used to link to US conflict from Minneapolis to Palestine, as the documents the Yale students published say. I don't want to spend too much time on this issue, but I'll say, as someone who's done field work in countries with conflicts, that participants on the ground understand their conflicts according to their own circumstances, without reference to Minnesota or anywhere else. You demean local participants, both Israelis and Palestinians, when you try to understand them by placing them in your conflict. So, and then there are, of course, outright anti-Semites who jump all over any controversy about Israel to feed in their own bigotry. What is clear is there's a whole range of mixed motives when there's more speech about Israel. Some of it, a large part of it, I would argue, is good. Some of it is problematic. What I do believe, what I am in favor of is when people such as myself say more speech, we really should say more careful speech. I'm not interested in censoring anyone, but I am interested in encouraging everyone to spend the time to understand the nuances and complexities of, yes, all sides of a conflict, and to try to put them into the context of the way the world operates. The political discussion has to be on an even keel. That's why I'm somewhat concerned about student governments who can poison collegiate atmospheres, but I'm very concerned about academic programs and institutions that should serve as a venue for arguments, not as a vector for particular opinions, and who develop, in fact, consciously anti-intellectual stances. These programs and departments go against the very idea of the more careful speech, which I'm trying to promote. To conclude, I'll say that anti-Semitism is a problem that suggests that all data suggests is going to get worse on society at large and on college campuses. It is going to be an ongoing concern and not go away. And we are on the verge, as I wrote in my article in August, of some potentially very serious incidents where physical harm is done to students. And there's already a great deal of mental and emotional anguish. Colleges and universities should go out of their way to be proving grounds to show how difficult issues which people feel passionately about can be discussed without bigotry and animus. Instead, they're going in the opposite direction, and maybe the places where Israel and the Middle East are least likely to be productively discussed. I think that would be unfortunate. I think college administrators should go out of their way to socialize their colleagues that anti-Semitism is a real issue, that bigotry can affect even those populations who may be coded as privileged, and that administrators are going to have to do a tremendous amount of work and exert significant political capital to make sure that the speech environment on their campuses remains free and fair. If we can do that, If we can figure out a way to discuss these issues without bigotry, then I believe that colleges and universities can reassert their stature as the primary intellectual centers of American life and model to a society which is polarized, divided, and which is rife with bigotry and hatred, how discussions can happen. I'm not sure that will occur on all campuses, but across the 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States, I hope that these issues, so vitally important to Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, non-Jews, and a great many other people across the world, can be developed in a way that people feel is productive, important, and free of fear and hostility. Professor Samuels, let me stop there. As I said, I'm honored to be able to talk with you, delighted to be able to address these subjects, happy to answer any questions that the audience may have.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Jeffrey. We're really very grateful for that really lucid and nuanced presentation. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. There already are some. I ask just to remind everybody to please submit your questions using the Q&A function, and I will ask them anonymously. So while those are coming in, I did have a few questions of my own to get us going. First of all, I was wondering if you could just go back to the way you started the presentation with the question of freedom of speech, because I think that is something that people find confusing, and especially the distinction between public and private universities. Is there any difference in what kind of speech is protected and not?
The First Amendment begins with Congress shall make no law. So it applies to government censorship, and it's been understood that it applies to public universities that are part of the American state. So formally, the First Amendment applies to public universities, but I'm sure my colleagues at Yale and every place else, certainly I felt this way at Colgate and Princeton, believe that everyone on those campuses should have the same rights of expression that are formally guaranteed when I was at Miami University in Ohio, a public university. So I think the Constitution may be one thing, but I think the norms that have been adopted certainly suggest that private universities aspire to the same free speech environments that public universities are required to have.
Okay, thank you for that. So here's a question that I had, but I hear it echoed in some of the questions from the audience. Can you be a little more specific about why those statements by the Yale College Council or by the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, we understand why you think it's problematic, but can you be a little more specific about whether and why you think that they're anti-Semitic? So in other words, where is that, this is another way of asking the question, where is the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
I hope I was nuanced enough in my presentation. I said that they can enable an environment where attacks on supporters of Israel converge on or lurch over to anti-Semitism. That's the important issue to me, because first of all, those statements change the level playing field that individuals have in debating these issues. And second, they go out of their way. They were quite striking, I thought, in delegitimizing the other side. It's not, they said, we think that the other side is wrong on the facts or on the data or on our opinion. They said it's illegitimate to have a different opinion. And the first statement also said some things about privileging certain perspectives in the academic practice. I'm not saying that per se is anti-Semitic. What I am saying is that enables an anti-Semitic environment. And I think is, before we even get to anti-Semitism, just exceptionally problematic in terms of academic practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Another question that, as someone, I think we both went to college in the 80s and you referred to the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s. And I think a lot of people, especially from our generation, but others, have a hard time understanding what the difference is between, opposing apartheid in the 80s and opposing either just Israel tout court or, the occupation, let's say now.
Look, I mean, if you want to take a position on Israel and oppose the occupation as an individual, that's your basis. What I'm saying is that I was not aware when I was at Princeton or Yale, when I was a graduate student, and Yale was a center of Southern African studies in the 1980s at the height of the apartheid conflict, that individual programs were taking political positions on this. Yale's response to the divestment debate in the 1980s was a wise one. It said, we're not going to divest, but we're going to invest significant resources in the study of Southern Africa and develop what I believe was the premier center for Southern African studies at the time. I thought that was exactly right. When you have programs and institutions take an opinion, I think that changes the nature of discourse. And I think it can be read as part of the politicalization of everything that we see. Fewer personal relationships, friendships across party lines, of fewer people trusting any source from the other side. And this politicalization of everything, also fueled by social media in its own way, has leached onto college campuses, and it's a problem. And I think it's one, irrespective, I think, as I said, of your opinion on Israel, that I would hope people would find problematic. Just like I said, if departments started taking positions on other issues, even issues I agree with, I would find it problematic.
So I think to play devil's advocate, and I have definitely heard this argument from people involved, especially I think in women, gender, and sexuality studies, ethnicity, race, and migration. They would say, or I have heard some people say, that their scholarship is about that kind of direct political action. So they don't really acknowledge, I think, a distinction between, their scholarship and their advocacy, let's say. So how do you?
I would say their scholarship is their business, and their individual advocacy is their business, and they have the right to pursue those intellectual and advocacy paths. Absolutely. It's where you invoke institutional authority that I think the line is crossed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what, there's an interesting question from the audience about, there's been so much in the news just this week about the influence of social media on these questions. So can you say something about how social media platforms have kind of driven the kind of polarization that we're seeing on college campuses?
Yeah, this is a generalization, but I'll start here. In the 1980s, when the college Democrats and the college Republicans on a particular campus had to find someone to talk with and debate, they found each other and they debated each other. And maybe they agreed or maybe they disagreed, but they were talking with each other, and being human beings, they recognized each other's humanity and friendships and social ties developed. Now people can live, if they're college Democrats or college Republicans or anything else, in their own ecosystem on social media without finding anyone who ever disagrees with them and any reason to moderate your views. So the filter bubble of social media, to borrow from a well-known phrase, I think has caused the increasing polarization of American society on just about every issue because the need to mediate positions in order to be socially acceptable, in order to develop ties, is no longer there. And in fact, almost anyone with no matter how extreme views can find others who share those views, when in the past there might have been others out there, but they weren't in the same town. So social media, which I have at the museum, I celebrated social media as the greatest explosion of public expression in human history. I still believe that. And many wonderful things have occurred. As another saying goes, the people formerly known as the audience now are able to speak. But some of what the audience says, we found out, some of what we've been thinking privately, in some cases, turns out to be problematic. And along with a great increase in democratization has come increased expressions of bigotry, hatred across many different levels, expressions of violence, as well as the ability of human traffickers, terrorists, and others to organize. So we have engaged in, let's say, over the last 15 years, we've completely changed our method of discourse. And it's not exactly surprising that norms haven't kept up. Whether those norms will ever reach where we are in social media, I don't know. I'd like to think, circling back to the topic, that colleges and universities can be, someone both works against the corrosive effects of social media, but it's hard because our students are the very ones who are most wired in and who have now, in their short lives, had lives which have been completely dominated by social media.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting really a lot of questions here. So here's an interesting one, and one that I've faced before too, certainly running a program devoted to the study of anti-Semitism. Do you think at all that the calling out anti-Semitism can result in shutting down dialogue on college campus, and how to negotiate that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Look, no side is right all the time. And there are certainly been accusations of anti-Semitism which are incorrect. And I'll say there have certainly been people who have tried to use the weapon of anti-Semitism to shut down debate. That's happened. And it is a possibility. And as I noted at the beginning of my talk, sometimes I'm ambivalent about talking about anti-Semitism because it immediately sucks all the oxygen out of the room, because you can't argue, well, I just disagree with you, without going to the anti-Semitic problem. How to negotiate that is very difficult. Sharansky has a three-part test. I think that's interesting in terms of how Israel is treated. I opted for something more ambiguous in my talk, frankly, and I gave a lot of thought to this in preparation for this talk. I think it depends on whether those talking have exhibited some kind of reasoned approach to where they got to their position. That's hard. That's easy to say and hard to discern, but I'm going to stick with it for the moment because I'm not willing to immediately shut down debate. I think that's bad. So I wanted to challenge people to say, how did you get there? What was the process that you got there? And if we can discuss that process, which is a long and difficult discourse, then maybe I still disagree with you, but I respect your sentiments. And I think that's the kind of discourse that colleges and universities should be especially good at.
Okay, so what do you think, this is, maybe a touchy question, but you can answer it how you'd like. What do you think President Salovey should have done in response to, let's not say the YCC statement, but the ERNM and women's studies statements? What would your advice to him have been to do?
Right. Hopefully modest in my recommendations of a campus I haven't been on in a long time and in a situation that I don't know well. I believe that these issues, and the statement from the first statement is on the Yale website. The second statement I pulled off the web. I believe that these issues and these statements and the issues they raise rose to the importance that a college administrator should say, look, this is problematic from the institution's stance. This is just over the line. It is not about academic freedom, which is assigned to individuals, not programs or centers. It is about the institution's ability to conduct its core enterprise, intellectual discourse. And I would have recommended to any president who had centers or programs on this that they make clear their opposition and explain, because I think this is an important moment, why this is not, in this case, an issue about Israel. I don't think it is. I don't think the Department of Economics should be issuing statements about how much deficit spending is appropriate, even though I'm sure economists have all kinds of views about it. It's just not what college programs should be doing. So I would have advised them to oppose it.
And it's interesting, I think, that in general, political science departments are really the least likely to issue these kinds of statements. At least it seems like, or to pass, BDS resolutions. It seems, I don't know if you could say something about why you think that these more identity-focused programs have been, the ones to do this.
I haven't been in the debates that these programs had. I wasn't part of the processes that were taken where these votes, where votes were taken, if votes were taken. I think it goes back to what you asked before, which is advocacy and scholarship in some areas is more directly manifests itself. Not only in these areas, I have friends who are constitutional scholars who are in political science departments who have their own advocacy, for sure, of their own political positions. But the scholars in both programs take as part of their intellectual enterprise political arguments that their program should adopt these platforms. And so that's the best I can say without being part of the debates themselves.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that, and I was involved in some of the efforts to keep the Modern Language Association from adopting a pro-BDS platform. And I really thought that was going to pass easily because there were, there seemed to be a lot of, very strong supporters. And what really emerged was that there were a lot of there was a small group, a relatively small group of very committed pro-BDS people, but that they were the ones making the most noise, and that in fact the larger membership of the MLA was not so anti-Israel. And I think there's some of that, that those voices tend to be the ones kind of controlling what's going on. I don't know if you've found
well I think that's often the case. I would say that people who made another manifestation of the problematic nature of these proclamations is that you will now be asked your political opinion on every single issue. What about this? What about that? Some programs, I think, have found themselves bogged down now in endless debates about their political positions, and they should have never gone down that route in the first place. As I said, if individuals want to have scholarship and advocacy, that's their business. It's when you invoke institutional authority that it becomes, I think, problematic for the university and challenging for supporters and others on campuses.
Okay, and I don't know if you could say anything about the effort to promote the the so-called working definition of anti-Semitism as a kind of campus speech code. Do you have any feelings about that?
I'm opposed to speech codes. Before we get even into the particulars of which definition of anti-Semitism, I think colleges and universities, when they start regulating speech, are in for trouble. And I think it's particularly inappropriate on a college or university campus.
Here's a question that I've seen echoed and several of the people have asked, and I'll ask it in two parts. So first of all, what would you say to parents of students many Jewish students who supported that YCC statement? I think there are a lot of parents who are confused about, how Jewish students now could sign on to what seems like an anti-Israel statement. So first of all, I'm sure you as the president of American Jewish University might have some experience. And then also what you would tell a Jewish student on campus now who feels uncomfortable in the current situation, what advice you would give?
Those are two profound questions, and my children, all in their 20s, graduated from college not that long ago. Look, on the first question, there are a lot of intergenerational debates about Israel right now in our society, including among families. I would say, talk to your students, take them seriously, don't believe that they've been brainwashed, and understand where they're coming from. If you disagree with them, argue with them, not in terms of parental authority, but take them seriously and take their arguments seriously. And you may find that you reach a meeting of the minds, or you may not. You can't always reach agreement, but I think all relationships are improved when people take each other seriously. In terms of Jewish students, and I'll refer back to the story at the beginning, I tell the guidance counselor who advised the student not to apply to Yale that they were wrong. I would say that's the ultimate victory for the anti-Semites. First of all, I don't believe that Jewish students shouldn't go to Yale. I believe they should. But I believe that Jewish students, like everyone else, should go wherever they want and should apply to wherever they want. And for the students who are afraid, sometimes legitimately, I'd say that this is the moment to organize and to be more forthright about your political positions and identity, to seek allies on the campus community and with college administrators. But that in the end, I believe that anti-Semitism will be furthered if we try to hide from it rather than confront it. Now, I recognize, easy for me to say, I occupy a particular position on a campus, and students are naturally often conflict averse, afraid to lose friends and the like. But this is the world in which we live. And I think if you can develop the tools, the attitude, the mindset to not only have a set of beliefs, but to feel comfortable with them and not to feel threatened, that's an important set of life skills.
Okay, terrific. Well, this gets us right to the end of our time today. I want to encourage people to read your great article from over the summer. And I think I don't have the link in front of me, but if you Google Jeffrey Herbst and Inside Higher Ed, it'll come right up. So please, you're not going to be able to see all the clapping hands, but I will do it for everybody. And on behalf of our very large audience today, I want to just say thank you for taking the time to do this and for your thoughtful presentation. And I encourage everyone who is here today to please sign up for the YPSA, the YIPSA mailing list. We have a whole range of very interesting talks planned for this year, and I hope to see you back at a future event. So thank you again, Jeffrey.
Thank you so very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.